On May 19, 1536, a queen knelt to be executed. But this was no ordinary death. Legend whispers a darker story, that Anne Boleyn wasn't alone on that scaffold, that she was carrying a secret, an unborn child, a male heir that could have saved her. For centuries, this rumor has haunted the Tudor legacy, a story of a king so ruthless he would murder his own unborn son just to get rid of a wife he no longer wanted. It's a shocking tale of tyranny and tragedy that's been told in books, films, and nightmares for 500 years. But is this horrifying story actually true? Was one of England's most famous queens killed while pregnant, a secret so dark the Tudors tried to bury it? Today, we separate the salacious rumor from the historical record. We're following the trail of evidence back through the centuries, into the treacherous heart of the Tudor court, to uncover the shocking truth. To understand how this dark legend even started, you have to get the world it came from. The Tudor dynasty, for all its power and glamour, was built on a foundation of bloodshed and insecurity. When Henry VIII took the throne in 1509, his family's claim to it was barely a generation old. His father, Henry VII, had won the crown on the battlefield, ending the brutal 30-year conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. That war had torn England apart, a bloody dynastic struggle between two rival branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York was a brilliant political move, uniting the warring houses and ending the conflict, at least on paper. But the peace was fragile. The Tudor claim was new, and there were still plenty of people with Yorkist blood who felt they had a better right to the throne. For Henry VIII, the survival of his dynasty, his legacy, and the stability of his entire kingdom rested on one thing. He had to produce a legitimate male heir. This wasn't just about pride. In the 16th century, a female ruler was almost unthinkable in England. The only time it had happened before, with Empress Matilda in the 12th century, it plunged the country into a civil war known as the Anarchy. A queen was seen as a recipe for weakness, instability, and foreign meddling. It was believed a woman couldn't lead an army or control the powerful, rebellious noblemen, that a daughter inheriting the throne would be an open invitation for rivals to make a play for power, potentially dragging England right back in a civil war. Henry's anxiety was only made worse by his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was a Spanish princess, a devout Catholic, and a deeply respected queen. For years, Henry loved her, but their marriage was cursed by tragedy. Catherine suffered through a heartbreaking series of stillbirths, infant deaths, and miscarriages. Out of at least 6 pregnancies, only one child survived, a girl, Princess Mary. As the years ticked by with no son, Henry's anxiety twisted into obsession. He became convinced his marriage was cursed by God. He found his proof in the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, which says, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an impurity, they shall be childless." Catherine had been briefly married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, before his early death. And even though Catherine swore that marriage was never consummated, Henry seized on this as the reason for God's anger. For a man like Henry, who saw himself as God's chosen ruler, this was a terrifying spiritual crisis. The fate of his kingdom and the salvation of his soul were tangled together. He needed a son, and he needed a wife who could give him one. His personal desires and his political duties had become one all-consuming quest. And into this pressure cooker of dynastic desperation and religious fear stepped a new figure, a woman who promised to solve all of Henry's problems, a woman who would change English history forever, Anne Boleyn. She wasn't just a potential new wife, she was the potential mother of a king. And in the high-stakes world of the Tudor court, that made her the most powerful and the most dangerous woman in England. Anne Boleyn was unlike anyone the English court had ever seen. She wasn't some meek noblewoman happy to be a pawn in a man's game. She'd been educated in the sophisticated courts of France and the Netherlands, and she came back to England in 1522 with a sharp mind, a sharper wit, and an electrifying style. She had a continental polish that made the other court ladies look, well, boring. She dressed in the French fashion, spoke the language perfectly, and carried herself with an air of confidence that verged on arrogance. People at the time described her not as a classic beauty, but as absolutely mesmerizing. The Venetian ambassador wrote about her swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, and eyes which are black and beautiful. It was this charisma that caught the eye of King Henry VIII. And Henry was a king who always got what he wanted. Soon, he wanted in. At first, Henry probably just saw her as his next mistress. After all, he'd already had an affair with her older sister, Mary. And had seen how that story ended. Mary had been used and then cast aside, and wasn't about to follow in her sister's footsteps. She refused to become Henry's mistress, a move that was as bold as it was brilliant. By saying no to the king, she completely captivated him. Her refusal was a direct challenge, and it only made him want her more. For years, Henry pursued her, writing a series of passionate love letters that we still have today, proof of his growing obsession. In a masterful game of romantic chess, and kept him at a distance. She knew her value. She wouldn't be his mistress. She would be his queen, or nothing at all. This incredible gamble turned a court flirtation into a national crisis. Henry's desire for and merged perfectly with his desperate need for an heir. She became the answer to all his problems. If he could just marry her, he could secure his dynasty and, in his mind, get right with God. And this kicked off a chain of events that would shatter Europe. Henry demanded an annulment from Pope Clement VII. But the Pope was stuck. He was basically the prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who just so happened to be Catherine of Aragon's powerful nephew. For 7 long years, the Pope stalled, trapped between the King of England and the Holy Roman Emperor. As the years dragged on, Henry ran out of patience. And her supporters, who were sympathetic to the growing Protestant Reformation, pushed for a more extreme solution. If the Pope won't grant the annulment, they argued, then Henry should just break with the Pope entirely. 2 brilliant and ruthless men, Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, gave Henry the religious and legal cover he needed. The plan was revolutionary. Henry would declare himself the supreme head of the church in England, cutting ties with Rome after 1,000 years. He would grant his own annulment. This plunged England into chaos. Friends of the king, like the great Sir Thomas More, were executed for refusing to go along with it. Monasteries were shut down, their incredible wealth pouring into the king's pockets. The very soul of the nation was being reforged in the fire of the king's ambition. And at the center of it all was Anne Boleyn. To her supporters, she was a Protestant hero. To her enemies, she was a venomous heretic and a conniving witch who had stolen the king from the true queen. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Shopweis, a fierce supporter of Catherine, always called Anne the concubine, or the whore, in his official reports. Finally, in late 1532, after years of waiting, Anne gave in to the king. She was pregnant. In a secret ceremony on January 25, 1533, she and Henry were married. Soon after, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declared Henry's first marriage void. And on June 1, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England. She was pregnant, and the entire kingdom held its breath, praying for a boy. The future of the Tudor dynasty rested in her womb. On September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth. But the child wasn't the prince everyone longed for. It was a healthy, red-haired baby girl named Elizabeth. It was a disappointment, but not yet a disaster, and had proven she could have a healthy child. All she had to do was get pregnant again and deliver a son. But time was running out. The king's obsession had been satisfied, but his need for an heir was as desperate as ever. The pressure on Anne was now immense. She had won her crown, but as she was about to find out, keeping it would be a far more dangerous game. So, Elizabeth's birth was a disappointment, sure, but the court saw it as just a temporary setback. Anne was young, fertile, and had succeeded where Catherine had failed for years. She delivered a healthy baby. Everyone expected a son would follow soon. By early 1534, Anne was pregnant again. A court servant wrote excitedly to a friend that the queen had a goodly belly, and Henry, sure that his prince was on the way, ordered a magnificent cradle. But what happened to this pregnancy is a bit of a mystery. By late summer 1534, something had gone wrong. Anne's great enemy, Ambassador Shopweis, wrote in September that, since the king began to doubt whether his lady was enceinte or not, he has renewed and increased the love he formerly had for a beautiful damsel of the court. The official records are silent. There's no mention of a miscarriage or stillbirth. Some historians think Anne suffered a late-term miscarriage that was kept quiet to avoid admitting failure. Others suggest it might have been a phantom pregnancy, where a woman's intense desire for a child causes her body to mimic the symptoms. Whatever the reason, the result was the same: no son. The cradle stayed empty. And that beautiful damsel Shopweis mentioned? That was a sign of things to come. Henry's eye was starting to wander, and the first cracks in the royal marriage were showing. And knew her position was precarious, her power, her influence, her very life depended on having a boy. 1535 came and went with no more pregnancies, and the tension at court grew thick. Anne's sharp wit and political mind, things that had once charmed Henry, now started to grate on him. She wasn't a quiet, obedient wife. She argued with him about how to spend the money seized from the monasteries, and clashed with his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. Her confidence was now seen as arrogance. She made powerful enemies who longed for a return to the old ways and for Princess Mary to be restored to the line of succession. By late 1535, a new face had caught the king's eye: Jane Seymour. Jane was everything and wasn't. She was fair, gentle, and quiet. Where and was fiery, Jane was meek. Henry's public flirtation with Jane was a humiliating slap in the face for Anne, a chilling reminder of how her own relationship with the king had begun. Seeing history repeat itself, Anne was terrified. Amid all this, Anne became pregnant for a third time. This was it. Her last chance. A son would shut down her enemies, secure her position, and win back the king. Everything was riding on this child. Then, on January 24th, 1536, disaster struck. During a joust, King Henry, who prided himself on his athletic skill, took a catastrophic fall. He was thrown from his armored horse, which then fell on top of him. The king lay unconscious for 2 hours. The court thought he was dead. Panic ripped through the palace. If the king died without a male heir, England could spiral into civil war. When the news reached Anne, who was about 3.5 months pregnant, the shock was overwhelming. 5 days later, on January 29th, the very day her old rival, Catherine of Aragon, was being buried and went into premature labor. She miscarried. The accounts from the time are heartbreaking. Ambassador Shopweis reported that the queen had an abortion which seemed to be a male child. She had been carrying her savior, a prince, and she had lost him. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political cataclysm. Henry's reaction was cold and brutal. His grief quickly turned to anger. When Anne tried to explain that her shock over his accident had caused the miscarriage, Henry was unmoved. According to Shopweis, he told her with chilling finality, "I see that God will not give me male children." He then reportedly told a courtier that he had been seduced into the marriage by witchcraft and that he now considered it void. This was the moment the tide turned against her for good. The miscarriage didn't create her vulnerability, it just exposed it completely. It was the final nail in the coffin for a king who was already looking for a way out. Her enemies, led by the calculating Thomas Cromwell, saw their chance. Henry's desire for Jane Seymour now had a divine justification. He could frame it as God's will. The whispers against the queen grew into plots. Anne Boleyn had lost more than a child. She had lost her only shield. And now, she was defenseless. The 4 months that followed Anne's miscarriage were a masterclass in political annihilation. With the king's protection gone, Anne's enemies moved in for the kill. The queen who had once been the center of the universe now found herself totally isolated. A chill fell over the court. People who once begged for her attention now avoided her gaze. She was a woman marked for death. Thomas Cromwell, the man who had engineered Anne's rise, now engineered her fall. A brilliant and ruthless politician, Cromwell likely saw that and was now a political liability. She was unpopular, she clashed over policy, and most importantly, she had failed to produce an heir. By helping the king get Jane Seymour, Cromwell could eliminate his rivals and secure his own position as the king's top minister. The plot took shape in April 1536. Cromwell launched a secret investigation, a fishing expedition for any piece of gossip that could be twisted into a weapon. His agents began interrogating people in Anne's inner circle. They were looking for evidence of adultery, which for a queen was high treason. Why? Because a queen's affair cast doubt on the legitimacy of the royal children, a crime against the state itself. The first to be arrested, on April 30th, was Mark Smeaton, a young musician from a humble background. He was taken to Cromwell's house for questioning. What happened there is a dark stain on Tudor justice. Smeaton was almost certainly tortured. Under duress, he confessed, to having slept with the queen. His confession, extracted through pain and fear, was the flimsy cornerstone of the whole case. But it was enough. It opened the floodgates. The very next day, May 1st, was the May Day joust. The king and queen sat together, a final public performance of a dead marriage. In the middle of the tournament, Henry got a message. His face changed. He stood up and left without a single word to his wife, and would never see him again. The next morning, the storm broke, and was arrested and told the charges. Adultery with multiple men, including Smeaton and several prominent gentlemen of the court. And most shocking of all, she was accused of incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were a grotesque fantasy, designed to be as shocking as possible. The incest charge, in particular, was meant to paint and not just as an adulteress, but as an unnatural monster, and was taken by barge to the Tower of London, the same fortress she had left in triumph for her coronation just 3 years earlier. As she entered through the Traitor's Gate, the reality of her situation must have hit her like a physical blow. She was no longer a queen, she was a prisoner. In the Tower, her behavior was erratic. She swung between hysterical laughter and tears, fiercely protesting her innocence one moment and falling into despair the next. She seemed to think it was all a terrible mistake, that if she could just talk to the king, he'd see the truth. She was tragically wrong. Henry had already moved on. While Anne was locked away, he was openly courting and celebrating with Jane Seymour. And the trials? They were a complete joke. The men were tried first. A broken Mark Smeaton pleaded guilty. The others bravely maintained their innocence, but it didn't matter. There was no real evidence, just gossip and fabricated timelines. Historians have since shown that on many of the alleged dates, and the accused men weren't even in the same place. But guilt had already been decided. They were all sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Then, on May 15th, it was Anne and George's turn. They were tried by a jury of their peers, a jury packed with their enemies, including their own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who presided over the trial. When it was her turn, Anne stood to face her accusers. Dressed in black, she was the picture of composure. She calmly and intelligently refuted every ridiculous charge. She maintained her innocence and her loyalty to the king. But it was a performance for history, not for justice. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty. The Duke of Norfolk, his voice trembling, pronounced the sentence. She was to be burned at the stake or beheaded at the king's pleasure. Upon hearing this, Anne didn't beg for her life. She simply maintained her innocence in the eyes of God. Even her most bitter enemy, Eustace Shopweis, had to admit the whole thing was a sham. He wrote that and was condemned upon presumption and certain indications, without valid proof or confession. Even a man who hated her could see this wasn't justice. It was a political assassination. So we come to the heart of the mystery, the core of this dark legend. Was Anne Boleyn pregnant when she was executed? It's a story that adds a final, gruesome layer to Henry's cruelty, suggesting his hatred was so deep he would knowingly kill his own unborn child, potentially the son he craved, just to be rid of her. It's a powerful rumor, but to find the truth, we have to act like historical detectives. First, let's look at the law. In Tudor England, there was a legal right known as pleading the belly. A condemned woman could claim she was pregnant to delay her execution. A jury of matrons, a panel of experienced women, would then examine her. If they found she was quick with child, meaning the fetus's movements could be felt, her execution would be postponed until after the birth. For a queen, of all people, to be denied this right would have been a shocking breach of law. And was a smart woman. She would have known about this. If she were pregnant, it would have been her last and only card to play. Yet, she never did. At no point during her trial or imprisonment did she ever claim to be pregnant. Next, we have to look at what people were saying at the time. The days between Anne's arrest and execution were the subject of intense gossip all over Europe. Ambassadors and chroniclers documented every rumor. And the most valuable accounts come from her greatest enemy, Ambassador Shopweis. Shopweis hated and was meticulous about reporting any news that made her or Henry look bad. He wrote about her miscarriage in January. He wrote about his doubts about her guilt at trial. He wrote about her final days and her courage. But in all of his detailed, hostile reports, there is not one single word about her being pregnant at the time of her execution. If such a huge scandal was even whispered, the king's greatest critic would have screamed it from the rooftops. His silence here is deafening. No other contemporary source, not a single one, mentions a pregnancy. And think about Henry VIII himself. His entire life was defined by his all-consuming quest for a male heir. He broke with the Catholic Church and risked civil war just for the chance of having a son. The idea that he would execute a wife who might be carrying that very son just doesn't make sense. Sure, he was infatuated with Jane Seymour, but his need for an heir was stronger. He'd waited 7 years for her. He could have waited a few more months to see if she'd deliver a prince. So if the evidence isn't there, where did this powerful story come from? The trail leads to a man named Nicholas Sander, a Catholic propagandist writing decades later, during the reign of Anne's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. Sander was a Catholic exile who hated the Protestant Reformation and everything and stood for. His book, published in 1585, was basically a hit piece designed to make Elizabeth I look illegitimate by trashing her mother. Sander is the source for many of the most monstrous myths about Anne. He was the first to claim she had 6 fingers and a giant mole on her neck. He painted her as a deformed, promiscuous witch. Sander's book created fertile ground for these myths to grow. His fictions were repeated as fact for centuries. The specific rumor about a pregnancy on the scaffold seems to have taken hold much later, pushed by authors who were either drawn to the drama of it or who misinterpreted sources. For example, some historians have pointed to a letter from Henry in April 1536 where he expressed hope that God would send him sons, twisting it to mean he knew and was pregnant. But that was just a common platitude at the time. In the end, the story of the pregnant execution is a myth. It's a legend born from political propaganda and fueled by our love for a dramatic, macabre story. It makes a tyrant king even more monstrous and a tragic victim even more tragic. But the historical evidence is clear. There is no credible source to support the claim that Anne Boleyn was pregnant when she died. The truth of her story is dramatic enough without it. In a final, strange act of what some saw as mercy, the king spared Anne from being burned at the stake. He also spared her the clumsy work of a local axeman. Instead, he paid to have an expert swordsman brought over from France. A sword was considered a cleaner, quicker, and more noble instrument of death, a small nod to the rank she once held. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to a private scaffold built on the Tower Green. A public execution was seen as too risky. Her death was to be witnessed by a select crowd of several hundred people, counselors, officials, and other notables. She was dressed elegantly in a dark gray gown trimmed with ermine. She didn't walk like a broken woman, but with the composure of a queen. She climbed the scaffold, showing no fear. Her ladies-in-waiting were weeping, but Anne was calm. She turned to face the crowd for her final performance. Her last words weren't a confession or an angry condemnation of the king. To attack the king would have been treason and could have put her daughter Elizabeth in danger. Instead, her speech was a masterclass in diplomacy. She said, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, but I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord." This praise of the king, so jarring to us now, was a required act of submission. But then, she subtly made her case. "If any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best." It was a quiet plea for history to look deeper, to find the truth behind the lies. After her speech, she knelt down, not on a rough block, but on the straw. Her ladies removed her hood and covered her eyes with a blindfold. As she prayed aloud, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesu, receive my soul." The swordsman needed a distraction. He reportedly called out, "Boy, bring me my sword." As Anne turned her head slightly at the sound, he swung the blade. It was over in an instant. One clean stroke. A cannon fired from the tower walls, the signal to the king, waiting miles away, that he was free. Free to marry Jane Seymour, which he did just 11 days later. The aftermath was as cold as the execution itself. No royal coffin was waiting. Anne's body and head were placed in an old arrow chest and buried in an unmarked grave in the tower's chapel. Henry VIII tried to erase her from history. Her portraits were taken down, her emblems removed, her name forbidden. He wanted it to be as if Queen Anne had never existed. But he couldn't erase her legacy. He couldn't erase the English Reformation she helped start. And he couldn't erase her daughter, Elizabeth, the little girl who would one day take his throne and become one of England's greatest monarchs, the living proof of Anne Boleyn's triumph and her tragedy. So, let's go back to our central question. Was a queen executed while carrying her heir? The historical verdict is clear: no. The story of Anne Boleyn's pregnant execution is a myth, born from political propaganda designed to demonize a queen and her legacy. So why has it stuck around for nearly 500 years? The reason is simple: it's a great story. The myth endures because it speaks to a deeper truth about the Tudor court, its brutality, its paranoia, and its capacity for breathtaking cruelty. It makes a monstrous king even more monstrous. It makes a tragic victim even more tragic. It captures the life-and-death game of dynastic politics in one horrifying image. But by focusing on the myth, we risk missing the truth of Anne's real and incredible legacy. Her true story doesn't need any embellishment to be powerful. Anne Boleyn was not just a victim. She was an agent of change, a woman of incredible ambition and courage in a world built to hold her down. She was a key player in the English Reformation. Her refusal to be a mistress directly led to England's break with the Roman Catholic Church, an event that fundamentally reshaped the nation. It was a revolution, and Anne Boleyn was at its center. And then, there is her most enduring legacy of all, her daughter. It's one of history's greatest ironies. In his obsessive quest for a son, Henry VIII cast aside 2 wives and executed one, only to be succeeded by the very daughters he had rejected. Anne's daughter, Elizabeth I, the child of a marriage declared invalid and a mother executed as a traitor, would go on to rule England for over 44 years. Her reign is remembered as a golden age. She became everything her father had wanted in a son: a strong, wise, and beloved ruler who secured the Tudor dynasty. In her daughter's magnificent success lies Anne Boleyn's ultimate vindication. The story of Anne Boleyn is a powerful reminder that history is often a battleground, where the truth can be buried under centuries of rumor. What other historical legends do you want us to investigate? Are there other dark tales or unsolved mysteries you think deserve a closer look? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into history's biggest secrets, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an investigation.